David Hale, welcome to ASPI. You say that China's president, Xi Jinping, could be the most powerful Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping. How could he achieve that?
Well, in the Communist Party Congress a year ago, they elected 7 members of the Standing Committee, and 6 are allies of Xi, and also were allies of former President Jiang, who's still a very major force in the party. So I think under his influence, Xi Jinping has the opportunity to become clearly China's most powerful leader since Deng Xiaoping.
And what do you think he could do with that power?
Well, obviously it means that the odds of him carrying out all the reforms outlined in the plenary in November could be achieved more easily, because you've got somebody who can basically knock heads, overcome powerful vested interest groups, people who are opposed to reform, who don't want to have a lot of changes. The downside, though, of course, is he's showing very little tolerance for dissent. There was a committee of intellectuals and lawyers formed over 2 years ago to fight corruption. They exposed middle-level bureaucrats wearing $100,000 wristwatches on their blog. And the leader of this movement, a man called Zhu, was convicted last week of basically creating disorder and sentenced to 4 years in jail.
But the corruption campaign, as you say, is having an effect on the party. It's actually dropping consumption of luxury goods, and your point that Chinese officials no longer wear watches because they're afraid of being exposed on the web. So it's having an impact.
I think what it shows is that Xi Jinping does not want third parties to control this process of ferreting out corruption. He wants it to be controlled by himself, by the government, the prosecutors and the judges that he controls and appoints. He doesn't want third parties doing it. Well, I think that's a mistake, because the fact is these third parties have had great success in exposing corruption. They've exposed people with the high-cost jewelry, people who own 30 or 40 apartments, people who have land in Australia and Canada, all of which comes from capital flight earned from bribes and from corruption. So I think they're playing a very valuable service, and they should be encouraged and not discouraged by arresting them and putting them in jail.
How much does your view about the strength of this new leadership team influence your view that China will have a relatively soft economic landing, that they can continue relatively high growth?
Well, I think what it means is they control the levers of power. So if we have an economic accident like we had 5 years ago with the global financial crisis, they can move very quickly to try and reverse those negative forces. During 2008, as the GFC was hitting around the world, China lost about 20 million manufacturing jobs in 6 months. It was a major blow to their foreign trade and their exports. That's when they announced a massive $600 billion infrastructure spending program. They allowed the bank lending to increase by 30% in 1 year, which is a very high number by any standard, and basically prevented the global recession from causing a major downturn in China. Because they fear, given their history, that if there were a major economic downturn, it might jeopardize the legitimacy of the Communist Party. And what's made the Communist Party legitimate is the fact they've had great economic success. There's been a huge increase in real income, a huge increase in living standards, and opinion polls today show 80% of all Chinese believe their children will have a better living standard than they had. In the United States and Europe, the numbers are 30 and 40%.
So do you accept the view that's been put to you by the Chinese that they can achieve 7 to 8% growth for another 20 years? Is that a claim that you would accept?
I can easily see it for 5 more years. Going out 20 years, it's more difficult because the labor force is shrinking, the environmental problems are very severe. I could see them ending up with a growth rate more like 5 and 6%, not 7 or 8. But it would still be a good growth rate compared to the old industrial countries. The European growth rate will be indefinitely at best 1 or 1.5%. The American growth rate, if things go well, 2.5 to 3. The Japanese growth rate, if things go well, 1.5. So China will be outperforming the old industrial countries, I think, for quite some time, but not by as big a magnitude as they have in the last 20 and 30 years when it was 10% plus.
You raised the idea, the possibility of a China-Japan accident, that in 1914 it was Britain and Germany going to war. In 2014, what chance Japan and China going to war? How big a chance is there of that sort of accident?
I don't think anybody wants a war. China and Japan are highly integrated. China is now Japan's largest trading partner, takes over 20% of their exports. During 2011 and 12, Japanese companies made $25 billion of FDI in China. They employ 1.2 million Chinese workers. And China depends very heavily on Japan as a major source of components to produce the finished goods they sell in North America and Europe. So China could not be a successful exporter without access to all these Japanese goods, as well as goods from Korea and Taiwan. What's interesting is that China has a trade deficit with East Asia and a big trade surplus with North America and Europe, because they buy the components in East Asia, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and sell the finished goods in the old industrial countries of North America and Europe, and Australia. And you know, it's a balancing act. But it means that with these new global supply chains, it's much more difficult to have a war than it was in 1914.
But it's thinkable. This is the really interesting thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's thinkable, and major Japanese leaders and other leaders in the region are actually making that 1914, 2014 comparison.
What I also would try and hold the 1914 comparison in check is the fact it wasn't just a German-British war. It began as a war between Austro-Hungary and Serbia. Russia took Serbia's side. This concerned the Germans because in the decade before the war, Russia had a great economic achievement. They had a huge increase in output. They were building lots of railways. And the Germans were terrified that over the next 10 years, Russia might become a military power they could not defeat. So there were people in Germany who were not adverse to the idea of a war to prevent Russia from having a takeoff. Meanwhile, of course, we had the long legacy of conflict with France going back to the Franco-Prussian War, Napoleon.
So the systemic pressures you don't see that are there now?
I don't think anybody else in the region wants a war for any reason at all. I think that Japan and China have ancient historical grievances going back to the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, then greatly magnified by the events of the 1930s and 1940s. But nobody else in the region wants a war. There's nobody right now worried that if China takes off, it might lead to some other country becoming a major threat. I think the focus is very much on this bilateral relationship, whereas the one in Europe in 1914 was multiple fronts. Serbia, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and then of course Germany, France, and Britain.
And China today would not be looking around for many allies. It's on its own in that sense.
China, the only ally China might have, and it's not really an ally, it's just a kind of dependency, is North Korea.
Yeah.
But North Korea is a very marginal country. It's of no consequence. Let me just add that what caused Britain to go to war in 1914 was when Germany invaded Belgium and jeopardized Belgian neutrality. That's what provoked the British to go to war. If the Germans had not invaded Belgium, only maintained the war on the French border itself, it's quite possible Britain would have gone to war until much later.
But there's a territorial trigger between Japan and China as well.
Yeah, it's the Senkaku Islands. Yeah. But these islands are just rocks in the ocean. They have very little economic value. There's lots of speculation there might be oil and gas there. China and Japan announced a plan 4 years ago to jointly explore for oil and gas in the East China Sea, but it hasn't yet happened. They have not yet actually had any effective cooperation. But they talked about it 4 years ago.
Would it be fair to say that you're a lot more optimistic about China than you are about the US political system and the ability of the US system to react to what's happening in Asia?
Well, my concern about the American political system is we're still waking up to the fact that China is this major economic power, and many people in Washington find it very hard to accept it. We had a vote 2 weeks ago in Congress on changing the IMF quotas. The US government decided itself way back in 1910 at the Seoul Summit that we had to change the IMF quotas to give a greater weight to emerging market countries, most of all China, but also Mexico, Korea, and Turkey. We've had these proposals floating around for 3 years. They were supposed to be implemented right now, and the House of Representatives in Washington voted it down 2 weeks ago, showing they don't recognize the need to make these reforms to accommodate the rise of China as a great economic power.
Does the US system still not recognize what's coming?
Well, the congressman told us in this vote 2 weeks ago they don't want to acknowledge what's going on. We also have this attempt to try and get the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal through Congress. To get that done, the president has to get what's called trade promotion authority. So we can negotiate a treaty with the other countries the Congress can't amend. Harry Reid, Democratic Senate leader, said last week he will not allow a vote on trade promotion authority. He's afraid that will offend the trade unions, core Democratic voters. So Obama's plans for a TPP are now effectively moribund. Ironically, all that may save it will be a Republican takeover of the US Senate in November in our midterm elections. Republicans aren't beholden to the unions. They generally support free trade. So ironically, Obama may need a Republican Senate to achieve his major trade policy as part of the pivot towards Asia. It's ironic, but that may be the reality.
Why do you say that for Australia that there is a high risk that in 10 or 15 years' time the US will not be able to guarantee Australia's safety?
Because on current trend lines, our defense spending is falling very sharply. It was 4.8% of GDP 2 years ago. By 2023, it may be down to 2.6% of GDP. And if we can't control the growth in entitlement spending, it may get squeezed down to only 2% by 2030. The number we're going to have in 2023, 2.6, is the lowest since 1940, when it was 1.7%. Roosevelt doubled that number in 1941, anticipating a war with Japan and Germany. Before Pearl Harbor even happened, he had a huge increase in defense spending. And since the end of the Second World War, we've had fluctuations based on Vietnam, Korea, the Cold War, and so on. But even after the Cold War ended in 1990, never went below 3%. It was always above 3. Now we're going to a record low compared to 1940. And my fear is the trend might continue in that direction. If we can't have some kind of miracle to control Medicare spending, or willingness on the part of Republicans to raise taxes. And right now, the core problem is Republicans will not raise taxes, and Democrats will not curtail entitlement programs.
And if, as you say, China is the biggest 21st century foreign policy challenge for Australia, that challenge is being driven by the fact that the US is going to start turning its eyes away from the set of obligations and the
I think the rise of China would be a challenge all by itself, because China is now your most important trading partner. It takes a third of your exports. That by itself is a challenge. But if it goes hand in hand with an American decline as a global military power, it compounds the challenge, because it means you must then be concerned not just about the economic relationship, but also your security. Now, I don't think there's any danger that China will want to invade Australia. They get all the things they want from Australia through trade and investment, ordinary commercial channels. There's no need to invade. But if in 15 or 20 years' time America is not a major military power, China would probably expect Australia to respect its power by not contradicting it on various foreign policy issues. Now,
how high a chance do you think there is that in 10 or 15 years' time, in your judgment, the US will not be a major military power?
I think it's a risk because of the current trend of policy in Washington, this gridlock that we have. And I don't see the gridlock ending anytime soon. All that would change this, I think, would be a new shock like we have with 9/11. I do think if we face a major foreign policy threat, the danger of war, or again, these terrorist attacks and so on, then I do think the American people could be persuaded we have to raise taxes to pay for national defense. But if you don't have a shock to galvanize the political system and the people, then I think this gridlock continues, and it means an ongoing squeeze on defense spending.
And for Australia, your line, I think, is quite a vivid one. For Australia, it means a foreign policy which is a crouching mode, where you might still be independent, but you're not going to be very assertive in the region.
I think that's exactly what it's going to mean. You're going to be independent, but you won't be assertive vis-a-vis China. You may be quietly critical. You may have your own views. You'll still allow people to come here and say things about China they don't like. You had dissidents here 2 years ago from Xinjiang province, a woman who was very outspoken. Chinese did not like that, but they couldn't stop it. You will still have your democratic traditions, free speech, and all that. But when it comes to foreign policy, China won't want you to be too critical or too assertive if they have a conflict with somebody else. And here I'm talking about Japan. When they had the air identification zone back in November, Australia criticized it on the grounds it was unilateral, but it was still critical. In 2030, you might not do that.
And the answer that you offer is that Australia will have to look for another ally, and the ally you're suggesting is India. Now, it's a hard enough choice for Australia to make choices between China and the United States.
Right.
Your proposition is it will be a choice between China and India.
Well, if you look at the geography and the population trends in this region, the only country in this region with potential to challenge China in a formidable way is India. India will have a larger population than China in 20 years because their birth rate is higher. They have a lot of babies. It'll be a much younger population than China. It has the potential, I think, to create a world-class economy like China's created here in the last 20 years. But India is still very backward. It's only 30% urban. China's over half urban. Infrastructure is very defective. It needs billions of dollars of new investment. Labor regulations left over from the British Empire get in the way of job creation. There's a lot of corruption. Indian defense budget is $45 billion, 1/4 of China's. India is still a very weak country. But if we had the right leadership, India could have an economic growth rate of 8, 9, or 10%, like China had in the 1970s and 80s, 1990s. And that would be for India the key to becoming a major economic power and a major political power. But that's, again, a 20-year scenario. It's not going to happen overnight.
David Hale, to finish, the United States has a great capacity to surprise, but the way your analysis is going, the surprise would be if the US continues to hold on to its status as the reigning superpower. Is that your surprise scenario for the US?
I think that would be a positive surprise compared to current trend lines. And that's why I mentioned events could be important. If we really do have a new shock like 9/11, or we actually see a war going on somewhere that would affect us, I think that could change our mind and lead to an increase in defense spending. But if we don't have a shock, I do fear that complacency could be dominant. And this obsession with budget deficits, obsession with letting entitlement programs grow uncontrolled, will ultimately squeeze defense spending more and more.
So healthcare in the US trumps being a superpower?
I think healthcare affects tens of millions of people. Defense spending affects several million people. And the political trade-off, therefore, is healthcare is the dominant political concern, not defense spending.
Thanks for talking to us.
Okay.